Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. D Stories. I'm a storyteller. I know you watch this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Now close your eyes, quiet your mind, take a deep breath in, and slowly let it out. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. You never forget the kind of winter that swallows a city whole. Washington, D.C., in January 2000 was colder than usual, silent, sharp, and slick with ice. The kind of cold that cracks pavement and hides truths under snowbanks. It was during one of those nights that Joyce Chang disappeared, and the city would never be the same. I was working in Judiciary Square at the time, just another federal clerk, living off vending machine coffee, and the kind of hope you only have in your 20s. My apartment was on the edge of DuPont Circle, just a few blocks from where Joyce was last seen. She was one of us, a smart, driven young attorney working for the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS. Everyone who knew her spoke of her warmth, her work ethic, her quiet strength. She wasn't a politician or a power broker, but in a city like DC, she still mattered. And on the night of January 9th, 1999, she vanished without a trace. That's when the city started whispering. But it wasn't until January 2000, a full year later, that the whispers became screams, when authorities finally ruled her death a homicide, and the tragedy took on a darker, more sinister tone. I remember the night she went missing because I had walked past the Starbucks at 21st and P Street NW around the same time. I didn't know her then, but I walked those same sidewalks, stood at those same crosswalks. The idea that someone could disappear so suddenly, so violently, from such a familiar space, it shook me. The official story is that Joyce had gone to the Starbucks with a friend that night. Around 8 p.m., they split up. He offered to wait for her cab, but she waved him off, said she wanted to take a walk. She was independent like that. Fierce, people said. Not reckless, just confident. She never made it home. Her brother reported her missing the next morning. At first, police weren't alarmed. After all, this was D.C. People disappeared sometimes, took off, changed their minds. But those of us who'd lived in the city long enough knew better. Joyce wasn't the kind of person who just left. 4 days later, her INS ID card and apartment keys were found on the banks of the Anacostia River in Anacostia Park, nowhere near where she was last seen. Her wallet and gloves were nearby too. And something about that detail, her gloves, always stuck with me. No one just throws their gloves in the river. Something had happened to her. But it wouldn't be until April, when a canoeist found her body on the Virginia side of the Potomac, that the truth started to unfurl. And as I would later discover, through court records, late-night interviews, and my own obsession with the case, the truth was far uglier than the city was prepared to admit. Joyce Chang didn't vanish into the night. She was taken, and whoever did it had done it before. The thing about Washington is that its surface gleams, marble buildings, neat parks, the slow grandeur of the National Mall. But just below that polish runs a current of secrets and silence. You learn early not to ask too many questions unless you're ready for the answers. After Joyce Chang's body was discovered in April 1999, floating off the banks of the Potomac near Jones Point Park, the case should have caught fire. A federal lawyer, Ivy League educated, the daughter of immigrants, murdered in the nation's capital? It should have lit the front page of every newspaper for weeks. But it didn't. Instead, it drifted, just like Joyce had. Quiet, unresolved. The Metropolitan Police Department at the time handled the case with the kind of public caution that reeked of political discomfort. Their early theory? Suicide. They suggested that Joyce had walked toward the river voluntarily somehow. That maybe she'd slipped. Maybe she had jumped. It was a theory that infuriated her family, and those of us watching closely. Joyce had left behind her purse, her gloves, even a dry cleaning ticket. She was in the middle of a life. She had dinner plans the next week. She was applying for a new post within the INS. There was no note, no signal, nothing. Even more damning, her autopsy, delayed for months due to the advanced decomposition of her body, showed no definitive signs of trauma. That, the police claimed, supported their theory. But what they didn't mention, and what I would later learn through a contact in the U.S. Attorney's office, was that there were bruises. Not just from post-mortem drift or water exposure. Pre-death bruising on her torso and legs, which suggested restraint or a struggle. The coroner couldn't be definitive, so the detectives held back. But Joyce's brother, Roger Chang, refused to stay quiet. He held press conferences, met with federal officials, demanded the case be escalated. He even walked the Anacostia River himself, searching for anything the police may have missed. He talked to everyone who had seen Joyce that week. He refused to let her name fade into a cold file. That persistence started to wear down the wall. In early 2000, after months of family pressure and renewed scrutiny by local journalists, especially a dogged investigative reporter from the Washington Post, the MPD and FBI officially reclassified the case as a homicide. That's when the details started to leak. First, the Anacostia Park clue, a torn piece of Joyce's coat, found snagged on a bush far from any walking trail. Second, a series of robberies that occurred in the same area during that same week. Young women targeted while walking alone, usually near nightfall. And then, perhaps most damning, the realization that Joyce Chang wasn't the only one. In 1999 and 2000, there had been at least 3 other incidents involving attacks on women in or near Anacostia Park. 2 of them had managed to fight off their attackers. One described her assailants as 2 Hispanic men in their 20s, driving a black Honda Civic with tinted windows. A composite sketch was drawn, but never widely circulated. Why? No one gave me a straight answer. I started to dig deeper myself. I wasn't an investigator, just a clerk with an unhealthy obsession and a lot of after-hours access to federal filing systems. I wasn't looking for glory. I just couldn't stop seeing her face. That smile, the senselessness of it all. And then I found it. A sealed report, buried under a case index for unrelated thefts, mentioning 2 suspects detained in 1999 for a string of assaults and carjackings that fit the same profile. The suspects' names were redacted, but the incident location? Half a mile from where Joyce's belongings were found. The more I read, the more I felt it, like a pressure behind my eyes. This wasn't an isolated crime. This was a pattern, hidden in plain sight, and someone somewhere in the chain of command had made a decision not to connect the dots. There's a strange moment when you're chasing a truth that doesn't want to be found, where the walls around you start to bend. You begin to question whether you're pulling at a thread or unraveling something much bigger, something that was stitched to stay buried. That's how it felt when I saw those redacted police reports. I wasn't supposed to have access to them, and I knew I'd crossed a line the second I printed them out. But once you hold something like that in your hands, once you realize that the system may have ignored, or worse, covered up patterns that led to a woman's death, you don't just walk away. The reports I found were thin on details, but one phrase was repeated across 2 separate incidents. Victim pulled from sidewalk near Anacostia Park. 2 Hispanic male suspects. Victim escaped. No charges filed. No charges filed. I stared at those words for what felt like hours. Through back channels, I reached out to a contact I trusted in the DC Metropolitan Police's Criminal Intelligence Unit, a mid-level analyst named Kayla Mendez, who had a reputation for remembering faces, cases, and file numbers like a steel trap. We met in a quiet Thai place in Adams Morgan one rainy Tuesday night. She brought a manila envelope and a look that told me this wasn't the first time she'd been asked to dance around the truth. "This doesn't leave your hands," she said, sliding the folder over. Inside were internal memos, emails between homicide detectives and the FBI dated late 1999. The memos discussed potential links between the Joyce Chang case and 2 attempted abductions in southeast DC, both committed by men later picked up in a stolen car sting near Capitol Heights. One of the suspects, according to the memo, had confessed to multiple muggings. The other had stayed silent. They were both undocumented, had no prior convictions, and were quietly deported in late 1999. No formal interviews, no questioning about Joyce Chang, no follow-up. Kayla leaned in. They thought it was cleaner that way. No mess. No headlines. Everyone wanted the Chang case off the books. I felt sick. Joyce's death was never just a mystery, it was a decision. A choice made by someone higher up to let it slip between the cracks. Over the next several months in 2000, Joyce's family pushed harder. Roger Chang went on local television. He talked about his sister's commitment to justice, her belief in public service, and the quiet dignity she carried every day. He begged for someone to reopen the case, and eventually someone did. In late 2000, the FBI launched a joint task force with MPD to formally re-examine Joyce's death as part of a possible series of targeted attacks on Asian American women in the area. They started combing old evidence, Joyce's personal items, the fibers from her coat, the location logs of public CCTV that barely existed back then. Nothing conclusive came out of it, but whispers started to circulate. There were rumors that one of the men deported in 1999, the Silent One, had confessed. Not to police, not to prosecutors, but to a family member in Guatemala, who later relayed it through a human rights NGO working near the border. The story was terrifying. He and his friend had followed Joyce from the Starbucks that night. They'd attempted to rob her, but she fought back. They panicked, forced her into the car. They drove her across the bridge into Anacostia Park and, in a scramble to silence her, held her underwater. The confession was never recorded, never documented in an official report. The FBI didn't confirm it publicly, but they didn't deny it either. All I could think about was her final moments, the cold water, the fear, the struggle. How close she'd been to home. How many people were nearby and never knew. The tragedy was brutal, but what stayed with me longer was the silence that followed, the way it was allowed to disappear, and the question that kept echoing in my mind. If Joyce Chang hadn't been a federal lawyer, would anyone have even noticed she was gone? Time moves differently in Washington. A scandal can rise and fall in a news cycle. A bill can die in committee with no obituary. But grief, real grief, lingers in the walls of this city. It doesn't make headlines, but it stays with those who were close enough to feel the loss. And in the year 2000, for the people who knew Joyce Chang, or knew of her, grief took on a strange, exhausting rhythm. What made it worse was how little anyone was willing to say, officially. I remember sitting in the back of a press briefing room at MPD headquarters in late September 2000. A deputy chief with a careful smile stepped up to the podium, gave a practiced nod, and read from a typed statement. At this time, the investigation into the death of Joyce Chang remains active and ongoing. No suspects have been charged. That was it. No names. No questions taken. They called it an open case, but everyone in the room knew what that meant. No movement. No pressure. No accountability. Behind the scenes, the frustration was boiling over. Roger Chang, now acting as the family's de facto spokesperson, was holding weekly calls with congressional offices. He reached out to organizations like the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, which began demanding answers. Civil rights groups started to quietly compile notes. There were murmurings of a civil suit, not against the perpetrators who had long disappeared, but against the DC government for negligence. Joyce had worked within the federal system. She had been part of the mechanism of justice. And yet, when she needed it most, that system had responded with delay, deflection, and silence. I remember one meeting vividly, a closed-door session at a Capitol Hill conference room where a half-dozen aides from different agencies gathered to discuss optics. Not justice, not evidence. Optics. One of them, a sharp-dressed man with a Department of Justice badge clipped to his jacket, said something I'll never forget. It's tragic, but let's not turn this into a referendum on interagency cooperation. I wanted to scream, because that's exactly what it was. The FBI, the MPD, INS, the U.S. Attorney's Office, they all had pieces of this case. And for nearly a year, none of them had spoken to each other in any meaningful way. They each held on to their corner, afraid that if they let go, the burden, or the blame, would land squarely on them. And so the case remained fractured, like broken glass swept under a rug. Meanwhile, evidence degraded. Leads went cold. One key witness, a woman who had allegedly escaped from the same two suspects who attacked Joyce, moved out of the country. Another, a park maintenance worker who had found her torn coat, died of a heart attack in August 2000. Time wasn't just passing. It was erasing. That's the cruelest part of cases like this. The longer they linger, the harder they are to resolve. Evidence doesn't wait. Memories fade. Files get misfiled. Boxes disappear into basements, and somewhere along the way, justice slips out the back door. Still, there were people inside the system who hadn't given up. One was an FBI field agent named Lisa Tran, a Vietnamese American who had quietly requested to be assigned to the task force after reading about Joyce's background. Tran began her own internal timeline, cross-referencing Joyce's last known movements with cell tower pings, bus schedules, even weather reports. She didn't work from a cubicle. She worked from her car, from coffee shops, from dark corners of public libraries. She called me one night, unprompted, after hearing from someone that I had taken interest in the case. "I just want you to know," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "We see her. Even if they never say her name on the record, we see her." I asked her what she thought happened. She paused. Then slowly, "I think she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I think the people who did it had done it before, and someone, maybe more than one person, made sure their names never made it into a file. That wasn't a theory. That was a resignation. By the fall of 2000, Joyce's story had mostly faded from the front pages. A new presidential election dominated headlines. There were protests over World Bank policy. The city was moving on. But some of us didn't. We couldn't. Because Joyce Chang wasn't just a file folder or a cautionary tale. She was a real person, one who worked every day to make this country better, fairer, more just. And now, her name was becoming a whisper in a city full of loud lies. By the winter of 2000, I had become used to the chill of unanswered questions. The seasons were changing again in Washington. The cherry trees had long lost their blooms, the air turned sharp, and a new president was about to be sworn in. The city was caught in that liminal space between administrations, a time when things could be buried or brought into the light, depending on who was looking. But Joyce Chang's story, like the final leaves skimming across the mall, seemed forgotten. Or so I thought. On December 14, 2000, a small, nearly unnoticed entry appeared in an internal FBI bulletin sent to field offices in the Mid-Atlantic region. The subject line read, "Unconfirmed corroboration, Chang homicide case, DC, 99-01725. I still remember the case number. It had burned itself into my memory by then. I managed to get a printed copy of the notice through someone at the Baltimore field office. It was short, terse, barely 3 paragraphs long. It stated that a former U.S. Customs informant, currently being held in immigration detention in Florida, had come forward with a statement. He claimed that in 1999, while serving time at a detention center in Georgia, he had briefly shared a cell with a man named Fernando A. from Guatemala. According to the informant, Fernando confessed during a late-night conversation that he and his cousin had killed a Chinese woman in D.C. during a robbery gone wrong. He said they dragged her, made her stop screaming, and then dumped her in the water where no one would find her. The bulletin emphasized that the informant had not yet been deemed credible. No full interview had taken place. No corroborating details had been verified. Still, the timing struck a nerve. Because back in March 1999, just weeks after Joyce disappeared, 2 Guatemalan nationals, Fernando Aguirre and Juan Carlos Ramirez, had been picked up in Prince George's County, Maryland, during a routine traffic stop involving a stolen car. At the time, the officers ran their names through local systems, found nothing, and lacking sufficient grounds for a criminal charge, passed them to INS for removal proceedings. I tracked down the public record of their deportation orders. They were processed and flown back to Guatemala on April 3, 1999. Joyce Chang's body was found 6 days later, on April 9th. There it was. The timeline aligned, too perfectly to be coincidence. And yet no one at MPD or the FBI would confirm whether Fernando Aguirre was the same Fernando A. mentioned in the bulletin. I reached out to Agent Lisa Tran again. When I brought up the name, there was a long pause on the line. Then she said, "That's not a name I'm supposed to comment on." But the tone in her voice told me everything I needed to know. The case was not cold. It was locked. Even within the FBI, the Chang case had become what insiders called a silent file. A case kept technically open, but one that required higher clearance to access. Normally that designation is reserved for national security concerns, counterintelligence operations, or cases with significant diplomatic sensitivity. Joyce's case didn't fit that mold, unless someone powerful had made a deal. There were rumors that Aguirre and Ramirez had been informants themselves, feeding information about gang movements across the DC-Baltimore corridor. Some said their removal wasn't a failure, but a deliberate decision to protect other operations. I never found documentation of that, but it would explain a lot. Why the early evidence was minimized, why MPD floated the suicide theory, why no charges were filed, even when the FBI believed a confession had been made. It was a trade. Joyce Chang's justice for silence. I can't prove that. Not in court. Not in print. But it's what I believe. In January 2001, Joyce's family issued a final public statement before withdrawing from media attention. In it, Roger said, "We have done everything we can. It is now in the hands of those with the power to act. We hope they do." They never spoke to reporters again. Not in detail. Not about the case. And slowly, the city turned the page. But for those of us who lived in that quiet storm, who sat in meetings where her name was whispered, who tracked paper trails that never led anywhere, we never forgot. Because Joyce's story wasn't just about a woman murdered in the dark. It was about the mechanisms of power, the cold calculus of politics, the silent choice made somewhere behind a polished desk that said, "This one can go away." It was the winter of 2001 when I realized Joyce Chang's death had changed me. Not in a poetic, neatly tied up way, but in that corrosive, slow burn kind of way. The kind that eats at your faith in the systems you once thought were unshakable. I was no rookie reporter. I'd covered corruption in Baltimore, indictments in Arlington, and backdoor dealings in city halls up and down the East Coast. But this case, it was different. Because in this case, I had seen every branch of the system quietly step away. Joyce wasn't just a victim. She had been one of them. A government lawyer. A child of immigrants who believed in rules, procedure, diplomacy. She was, in many ways, the very embodiment of the American dream. And her death. It should have lit up the city like a flare gun in the night. But instead it flickered out, smothered in bureaucracy, bad PR, and political calculations. Around February 2001, something strange happened. I was contacted by a woman named Claire Danforth, a former assistant U.S. attorney who had once worked in the same DOJ building as Joyce. She was older, sharp-witted, with a look that told you she'd seen too much and was tired of being quiet about it. She told me she'd read my earlier reporting and had something I might want to see. We met in a coffee shop off K Street, in the back corner where lawyers went to avoid being overheard. Claire pulled out a thin file folder and tapped it once with her finger. "This is unofficial," she said. "It doesn't exist in the record, but Joyce gave it to me 2 weeks before she disappeared." Inside were photocopies, emails and notes that Joyce had apparently been collecting. They weren't related to her legal caseload. They were personal observations, sketches. She had started tracking something she described in one of her memos as a recurring pattern of street-level harassment around DuPont and Adams Morgan. In particular, Joyce noted instances where women of Asian descent were being targeted in what appeared to be coordinated thefts, gropings, or attempted abductions. Most never reported the incidents. Some were brushed off by police as misunderstandings. Joyce had begun compiling them into a list, a homemade map of concern. One line chilled me to the bone. "Same man, third time. Where's Oriol's cap? White Toyota. Southeast plates. Called 911 but no response." That entry was dated December 19th, 1998, over a year before she vanished. No one had followed up. No one even knew the list existed, except Claire, who Joyce had trusted to hold it. I brought this information to Lisa Tran at the FBI. Her reaction was more than professional, it was personal. She went quiet, then said, "This is the thread we never pulled. We thought she was just in the wrong place, but maybe she was onto something." It was the first moment in months I felt a flicker of movement, like the frozen surface of this case might finally crack. Lisa reopened her internal notes. She started cross-referencing Joyce's memo with reports from local precincts, many of which had never been digitized. Some were just scribbled paper forms from community substations, yellowed with time. What she found was horrifying. From 1997 to early 1999, at least 7 reports had been filed by Asian American women describing incidents involving a small group of Hispanic men operating out of a beat-up Toyota. In 3 cases, the women reported being followed for blocks. In 2, they were physically assaulted. In 1, a woman claimed she was nearly shoved into a car but managed to escape. Each case had been closed due to lack of evidence. None of the reports had been linked together, and none had been considered during the initial investigation into Joyce's disappearance. It was a devastating realization. Joyce hadn't just been unlucky. She had been watching a pattern unfold, one that threatened people like her, and no one listened. Worse, the very system she believed in had buried it, like a dirty little secret. At that point, I stopped thinking of this as a whodunit. This was institutional failure. It wasn't just about Joyce. It was about the blind eye turned toward women who weren't loud, who weren't privileged, who didn't make noise. Joyce did everything right. She saw something. She tried to track it. She raised her voice quietly, but with precision. And still, she vanished into the dark. By mid-2001, Lisa began lobbying for a full internal review. She called it Operation Lingua, named after the Latin word for voice. The goal was to review every cold case in D.C. from 1995 to 2000 involving Asian American women. She didn't get approval for the project, but she didn't stop pushing. Meanwhile, Claire submitted Joyce's notes to the National Center for Victims of Crime. They started using it as a case study for how systemic bias and fragmented reporting can cost lives. Joyce Chang's case hadn't been solved, but her voice, long silenced, was finally being heard, in whispers at first, then in policy circles, then in classrooms where young law students read about her case and asked the question that echoed through everything. What happens when justice looks away? It was the autumn of 2002 when I first stood at the edge of Anacostia River again. I had returned not as a reporter chasing leads, not as a storyteller crafting timelines, but as someone quietly mourning the echo of a woman I never truly met, someone who, over the years, had come to feel like a friend I failed to save. The shoreline had changed since April 1999. A new walking trail curved alongside the water, and the cracked concrete where Joyce's jacket was found had been paved over. But the air was still thick with that same damp silence. It's the kind of place that doesn't forget. I wasn't the only one who had come back. A small plaque had been installed there, just a few feet from where her ID card was found. It was simple. No headline. Just a name. Joyce Chang, 1970 to 1999. Public servant. Beloved daughter. Never forgotten. There was no mention of murder. No reference to the investigation. But to those who knew, to those who had followed the case, the plaque was a quiet protest. A refusal to let memory fade. That year, something else began to shift. Under the pressure of activists, the DOJ quietly initiated a departmental review of missing persons protocols involving federal employees. It wasn't publicized. It didn't make headlines. But the internal memo landed on my desk through a contact at the Washington Post. The memo cited the Chang case directly. It acknowledged that Joyce's initial disappearance had been mishandled due to communication gaps between agencies and a failure to apply internal protocols for at-risk federal personnel. It also mentioned, for the first time in any official capacity, the presence of undocumented suspects who had since evaded prosecution due to jurisdictional and procedural limitations. It was as close to an admission of guilt as the government would ever offer, and still no arrests, no indictments, no names released to the public. But the ripples kept moving. That winter, a young congressional staffer named Rachel Kim, whose sister had also been a victim of a violent robbery in D.C., introduced a draft proposal through her representative. It was called the Chang Initiative, and it sought to create a centralized federal alert system for missing employees, similar to the Amber Alert, but tailored for adults in public service. The idea wasn't just about notifying law enforcement. It was about closing the 24-hour gap, the critical window when most missing adult cases, especially in urban areas, were still dismissed as voluntary disappearances. The bill never passed the full House, but parts of it were adopted by executive directive in early 2003, resulting in a system that quietly and consistently saves lives today. And Joyce's name is there, in the appendix of the directive, in the testimony notes submitted to subcommittees, in the footnotes of victim advocacy training manuals across the country. She became more than a victim. She became a signal flare for all the cases like hers that never made the front page. I once asked Roger Chang, who by then had returned to private life in California, how he wanted his sister remembered. His response stayed with me, not as a ghost, as a presence, something that keeps people alert, keeps people kind. Over the next few years, I found myself invited to more panels, more lectures, more roundtables on how we fail victims long before the violence begins. And every time, I brought Joyce's story with me, not as a sensational mystery, but as a map of missed chances. One day, in 2005, I met a young prosecutor in training who told me she joined the Justice Department because of Joyce Chang. She had been 12 when Joyce disappeared and remembered her parents whispering about it at the dinner table. She looked like me, the woman said. She did the kind of job I wanted to do. She didn't get her ending. I want to give other women theirs. That's when I understood something else. Closure isn't always about handcuffs. It's not always about a judge reading a sentence or a press conference declaring a case solved. Sometimes closure is quiet. It's the slow act of honoring someone by refusing to forget them. It's the long memory of a city that often moves too fast. It's a plaque by the water, a law buried in fine print, a young woman choosing her path because someone else had theirs taken away. Joyce didn't disappear into the dark. She became part of the light that others now carry. In the years that followed, Joyce Chang's name became more than a footnote in a cold case file. It became a symbol, but not in the way the media likes to sculpt symbols. This wasn't about sainthood or martyrdom. It was about what happens when society, law enforcement, and the justice system fail quietly, not through dramatic corruption or overt bias, but through the everyday erosion of attention, empathy, and belief. To understand that legacy, you have to first understand the context of Washington, D.C. in 1999 and 2000. The city was, as always, a paradox, powerful and powerless in the same breath. It was home to embassies, federal agencies, and the White House, but also to underserved communities where police response times stretched longer and the murder clearance rate hovered at less than 50%. People knew the rules. Certain stories got airtime, others didn't. Certain victims got justice, others got forgotten. Joyce Chang's case fell into an uncomfortable space, not ignored, but not fully seen. She was a young Asian American woman, a government lawyer, educated, soft-spoken. Her disappearance was reported. Her story aired on the news, but it never ignited national outrage the way other cases might have. Contrast her case with that of Chandra Levy, another young D.C. woman who vanished in 2001. Both were federal employees. Both were in their 20s. Both disappeared without warning. But Levy's case exploded into a media firestorm, in part due to her rumored romantic involvement with a congressman. Networks ran daily updates. Talk shows debated her fate. Congressional hearings mentioned her by name. Joyce never got that storm. She got a shrug. Years later, community organizers and scholars would look back at Joyce's case as a touchstone in understanding how intersectional invisibility functions in real-world tragedies. She was a woman. She was Asian American. She didn't fit the profile of who society imagines as the typical crime victim. And when she tried to speak up, tracking patterns of harassment and violence in her own neighborhood, she was quietly dismissed. The system didn't ignore her because it was evil. It ignored her because it wasn't built to listen to her voice. That's the part that stings the most. By 2006, her name began appearing in academic articles about victimology and racial bias in criminal investigations. Professors at Georgetown and American University taught segments of her case in classes about missing persons law, particularly focusing on how women of color are often deprioritized unless their cases generate political heat. One criminologist, Dr. Angela Nardi, wrote, "Joyce Chang's story is not about a body in a river. It's about how society defines whose life is urgent and whose death is negotiable." That quote was later carved into the side of a memorial scholarship fund established in Joyce's name. It was set up by her family with donations from colleagues at the DOJ, and it continues to fund law students from underrepresented backgrounds today, many of whom go on to careers in public service, advocacy, and criminal justice reform. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, there were quiet acknowledgments. An internal MPD audit in 2007 included a reference to the Chang case as a lesson in premature case classification. Though the report was never made public in full, excerpts noted that labeling the disappearance as voluntary in the first 48 hours likely stunted the early investigation, especially in gathering surveillance and canvassing the park where her items were found. Some officers admitted off record that had Joyce been blonde, white, or politically connected, the case would have been handled differently. That kind of honesty came late, but it came, and it inspired something else, a generational shift. By the early 2010s, a new wave of activists, many second-generation immigrants themselves, began organizing under hashtags like #SayHerName and #NotInvisible. Joyce's story was cited often in these circles as a cautionary tale, but also as a rallying cry. They used her case to highlight how invisibility operates not just at the level of the individual, but in the very design of media coverage, policing priorities, and public empathy. One 2015 documentary short, Still Searching, the Joyce Chang story, produced by an independent Asian American filmmaker, wove together interviews with her friends, her brothers, and former investigators. It was quiet, mournful, and devastating. It ended with a scene at the Anacostia River, the camera lingering on the water as her voice, taken from an old answering machine message, played softly over the credits. She had said, "Hi, it's Joyce. Just checking in. Hope everything's okay." That was her legacy, checking in on a world that didn't check back fast enough. And that's what makes the pain of her story linger. Not just because she died, but because she died trying to prevent others from being harmed, and still, somehow, wasn't believed. Because the very notes she left behind, the warning signs she circled and flagged, were ignored until they became evidence in her own case. Because her disappearance wasn't inevitable. It was preventable. That's what the story of Joyce Chang leaves us with. A mirror, a challenge, a question. Who do we hear when they whisper? Whose fear registers as real? Whose silence do we remember? The last time I visited Joyce Chang's resting place, it was spring. Cherry blossoms in bloom across the Capitol, their petals fluttering like whispers over the marble steps and iron fences of Washington, D.C. I stood beneath the canopy of pink and white trees in the National Memorial Park Cemetery in Falls Church, Virginia, just a few miles from where she lived and worked. The wind was soft that day, and sunlight broke gently through the clouds. At her gravestone, someone had left a folded note, weathered at the edges but still legible. It read, "You did everything right. We didn't. I'm sorry." No name, no explanation, just a truth distilled into 12 words. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The words said everything. Because that's what haunted those who had followed her case. Not just that Joyce died, but that she had done everything right. She had told people about suspicious men. She had warned colleagues about dangers near her home. She stayed on the phone with a friend while walking home. She was careful, smart, aware, and still she vanished. Silenced, forgotten by systems meant to protect her. In the years that followed her disappearance, every attempt at posthumous justice met the same walls. Deportations, lack of cooperation from international authorities, and bureaucratic inertia. The primary suspects, two undocumented men tied to a series of robberies in D.C., were deported to Guyana in 2001 and never prosecuted. FBI sources, under deep background, admitted they had built a strong circumstantial case, but the evidence had grown cold, degraded by time and the mishandling of the earliest days. No one was ever charged with Joyce Chang's murder. Her family, particularly her brother Roger, once told me in an interview that closure wasn't about convictions, it was about acknowledgement. And in that sense, perhaps some justice did come, but it came in fragments. It came in the Department of Justice quietly changing internal reporting systems for missing employees. It came in law students receiving scholarships in her name. It came in police departments using her case as a training example of what not to overlook, of how to listen early. It came in documentaries, candlelight vigils, and academic conferences on race and justice. And it came in stories like this one, retold not for spectacle but for memory, because memory is a form of resistance. To forget her would be to let the silence win. I sometimes imagine Joyce walking through DuPont Circle on that last Sunday evening in January 1999. She stops to buy tea, holding a plastic bag and her keys. She's smiling, maybe humming a song. She's tired like all of us are on Sunday nights, thinking about Monday, about work, about deadlines. But she's alive in that moment. Not a victim, not a cautionary tale, just a woman in her late 20s with a full life ahead. And then I think about how quickly that life was stolen, how quickly her identity was reduced to file numbers and case summaries, how the person she was, her ambitions, her humor, her immigrant roots, her dreams, almost got buried beneath bureaucracy and headlines that called her missing before they called her human. That's what I've come to understand about true crime after decades of storytelling. The real tragedy isn't the death, it's the forgetting of the life. And Joyce lived. She was born in Chicago in 1970, the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants. She grew up in California, graduated from Smith College, worked for Senator Paul Simon, and served as an attorney at the Immigration and Naturalization Service. She volunteered. She mentored. She made time for family and friends. She kept old letters and wrote heartfelt cards on birthdays. She mattered. And that's why this story matters. Not because it ended in a courtroom, it didn't. Not because the perpetrators were caught, they weren't. But because remembering her is an act of collective care. It's our answer to a question this city never asked aloud. What is a life worth when no one is looking? When you read about Joyce Chang, you aren't just reading about a case. You're reading about a culture, a system, a silence that still echoes today. Every time a missing woman of color gets buried beneath the news cycle, her story warns us again. Every time a young person studies immigration law because of Joyce, her story teaches us again. Every time someone walks through DuPont Circle and remembers, not the crime, but the woman, her story lives again. That's what storytelling does. It doesn't bring justice, but it refuses injustice the power of erasure. And so I end this story not with a resolution, but with a presence. Joyce Chang, born December 7th, 1970. Died January 1999. Remembered still. May we never stop telling her story. Story 2. July 27, 2000. Atlanta, Georgia. I can still remember the sticky heat of that Thursday afternoon, the kind that clings to your skin like guilt. The sun was relentless, casting long, harsh shadows down Peachtree Street. I was 2 blocks away from the All-Tech Investment Group office when the sirens started wailing, a fractured, shrill harmony that split the city's usual hum in two. At first, I thought it was just another accident, another casualty of Atlanta's frenzied midday traffic. But then came the police cruisers, swarming toward Buckhead like bees to blood. Something was wrong. Very wrong. My name is Daniel Brooks. At the time, I was a junior reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, mostly covering finance and local business. My editor had just sent me a tip, a situation unfolding at an office park on Piedmont Road, just north of Lenox Mall. Some kind of shooting, he said, possibly financial related, might involve day traders. Those words barely registered until I heard the name over the police scanner. Mark Barton. It hit me like a punch to the ribs. 2 weeks earlier, I had met him. He was a quiet man, mid-40s, well-groomed, with a nervous smile that twitched at the corners of his mouth like he was always on the verge of telling a joke he didn't believe in. He sat in a glass-walled cubicle at All-Tech, fidgeting with a mouse, watching green numbers flicker on 6 separate screens. I was doing a piece on the rise and fall of day traders, the amateur stock cowboys who tried to make fast money during the dot-com roller coaster. Mark was a perfect subject. He'd lost big. Everyone at the office knew it, but none of them knew how far gone he really was. When I reached the scene, the street was already crawling with FBI agents, ATF officers, and SWAT snipers perched on rooftops. Yellow police tape flapped in the thick, humid air like warning flags. I flashed my press badge, heart pounding. I'd never seen this many bodies in one place. Not like this. People were crying, some in silence, others in loud, animalistic howls. I recognized one of the day traders I'd interviewed a few months ago. He was sitting on the curb, hands over his face, shirt soaked in blood. Not his own. Inside the building, the horror unraveled detail by detail. Barton had walked in shortly after lunch, armed with a Glock 9mm and a .45 caliber handgun. No mask. No shouting. No warning. He moved from room to room, shooting everyone he saw. 4 dead at All-Tech. 5 more at Momentum Securities, another day trading firm just down the street. Dozens injured. It was surgical. Cold. Planned. But the worst part hadn't even come out yet. What we didn't know, what even the cops didn't know, was that Barton had already killed his wife and 2 children before he ever stepped foot in the office that day. The massacre had started long before the first bullet echoed off office walls, and I was about to follow the trail back to its origin, into the darkest corners of a man's mind, where the collapse of a dream became a death sentence for everyone he loved. Before the tragedy that would stain the headlines of every newspaper in the country, Mark Barton was just another man chasing hope. To the outside world, he was quiet and unremarkable, mid-40s, clean-cut, the kind of man you wouldn't look twice at in a grocery store or passing in an office corridor. But beneath the surface, something fragile had been cracking for years. I had seen it before in others, men who tied their entire worth to success, especially financial success. Day trading was seductive in that way. You could go from nobody to somebody in a week, or so people believed. Mark had that same belief once. I could see it in his eyes during our interview. A flicker of pride whenever he talked about his earlier wins, followed by a slight tremor when losses were mentioned. He was a trained chemist, had worked in the textile industry for years before switching careers. Life, it seemed, had handed him enough disappointments to wear a man down. A failed marriage, legal battles, false starts in business. When the tech boom began surging in the late 90s, Barton saw a way out, a new identity. Like many, he poured everything he had into day trading. And like many, he lost. Records showed he had traded nearly every weekday at both Momentum Securities and All-Tech Investment Group. Between the 2 firms, it's believed he lost close to $100,000 in just a few months. But what made Barton different wasn't the money. It was how personally he took it. To him, the market didn't just take his savings. It took his dignity. Colleagues at both firms described him as increasingly withdrawn in the weeks leading up to July 2000. He stopped socializing, spoke less. Some noticed he no longer reacted when trades went south. One trader told me later, it was like he wasn't there anymore, like he had already checked out. But what none of them could have known, what none of us did, was that by the time he returned to Alltech that Thursday afternoon, something far worse had already happened. 2 days earlier, on July 25th, Barton had left Atlanta and returned to his home in Stockbridge, a quiet suburb on the southern edge of the metro area. Neighbors later said he seemed calm that evening. Nothing unusual. The blinds were drawn. Inside, however, Barton had made a series of irreversible decisions. His wife, Leanne, and their 2 children, Matthew, 11, and Michelle, 8, were no longer seen after that night. It would be days before the truth of what happened in that home came to light. And when it did, it redefined the scope of the case from a workplace shooting to something much darker, an unraveling that had begun behind closed doors. The next morning, Barton returned to Atlanta as if nothing had changed. He even stopped by Alltech, exchanged small talk with former colleagues, and smiled. One woman remembered he brought in breakfast pastries. He was so normal, she said later. Too normal. And that's what haunts me. Because I too had met that version of Mark Barton. The one who could sit across from you, sip coffee, and seem completely at ease, even as everything inside him had fallen apart. The official manhunt didn't begin until after the shootings at Alltech and Momentum that Thursday. But Barton was already gone. By the time police swarmed both offices and began gathering evidence, he had vanished into Atlanta's sprawl, slipping past roadblocks, changing vehicles, and heading somewhere. I spent that night in the newsroom, cross-referencing addresses, calling sources, and listening to scanner chatter. The city was on edge. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Armed officers patrolled Midtown and Buckhead. I remember the editor's voice behind me, sharp and heavy. He's not just a shooter. He's a ghost now. And behind him, a family home sat quiet in Stockbridge, holding the answers no one wanted to believe. That night, July 27, 2000, Atlanta didn't sleep. The city was wide awake, pulsing with the hum of helicopters, the bark of radios, and the dull, unsettled murmur of millions of people asking the same question. Where is he? Every local channel ran live updates, switching between aerial views of the city and shots of officers combing parking lots, wooded paths, and interstate on-ramps. SWAT teams were on standby. The FBI had already taken over coordination, treating it as both a local and federal matter. After all, Barton had crossed city lines, county lines, and, presumably, state lines. He was now the subject of one of the largest manhunts in Georgia's history. And yet, somehow, he seemed to disappear. In the hours following the attack at Alltech and Momentum, investigators retraced his steps. Surveillance footage showed him walking calmly from one building to the next. No running, no panic. Eyewitnesses said he barely spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply entered, looked around, and carried out a plan that no one could comprehend. But by 4 p.m. he was gone. No car seen leaving. No witnesses who could confirm his exit. I remember sitting at my desk at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, staring at a map of Metro Atlanta, trying to guess where a man like Barton would go. Would he flee north toward the mountains? Or head south, disappear into the back roads and pine-covered counties that blur into Alabama? Every road felt like an open door. Then, just after midnight, a call came in from a small motel off Cobb Parkway in Ackworth, northwest of the city. A clerk had recognized Barton's photo on the news. He had checked in earlier that evening under his own name. Paid cash. Alone. By the time police arrived, the door was locked from the inside. They knocked, then pounded. No answer. When they finally entered, they found him inside. It was over. News of Barton's death reached the newsroom before dawn. A few reporters cheered, not out of joy but exhaustion. Relief. For the families of the victims, the city, the police, and maybe even for those of us trying to write about it, his death felt like a door slamming shut. No trial, no escape, no chance for answers. But that was the thing. Even as it ended, there were still so many questions. In his motel room, investigators found a handwritten letter, nearly 2 pages, placed neatly on a table beside his wallet and keys. It wasn't a confession. Not exactly. It was more like a farewell from someone who no longer saw himself as part of the world. The tone was strange, part apologetic, part defiant. He spoke of pain, of losing everything, of not wanting his children to suffer the way he had. That phrase stuck with me. What did he mean by suffering? Financial loss? Shame? Isolation? He didn't apologize for the people he had hurt, at least not directly. He wrote of love, of failure, but not of remorse. Not really. In some ways, the letter raised more questions than it answered. By the time the sun rose over Atlanta the next morning, the city was waking up to more than just the end of a manhunt. It was waking up to the weight of grief that comes after a storm, silent and overwhelming. There were flowers piled outside both trading offices. I went to Alltech that afternoon. The building was closed, but people stood along the sidewalk, many of them in business attire, just watching. Nobody spoke. One woman knelt and left a note under the police tape. I caught a glimpse of the first line. "You didn't deserve this." No one did. Not the employees, not the children, not the families who would never see their loved ones again. What Barton left behind wasn't just a series of tragedies, it was a vacuum. A haunting space where something once human had unraveled. And the question that stayed with me, that still stays with me, wasn't just why did he do it. It was how close had he come to hiding it all completely. The next morning, Atlanta was quieter than usual. I remember walking from the newsroom to a nearby coffee shop on Marietta Street, and for once, the morning rush felt subdued, muted, like the city was holding its breath. No honking, no chatter. Even the barista had the television turned down low, but the images on screen were unmistakable. Barton's face, passport style and cold. The motel, the crime scenes, the children. His name had become a headline, but to me, it hadn't yet become real. I still remembered him as the man who nervously tapped his pen against a styrofoam cup during our brief interview. That image refused to reconcile with what I now knew. By that day, July 28, 2000, the full story had begun to take shape. Authorities had discovered the family home in Stockbridge, and with it, the final and most devastating truth. The residence was a modest, two-bedroom apartment in a quiet complex surrounded by well-maintained landscaping, American flags, and tricycles abandoned near mailboxes. I visited the neighborhood 3 days after the discovery, trying to understand the final chapter of Barton's life. Neighbors were stunned. One man told me he'd seen Barton mowing the lawn just the week before, waving at passers-by with a slight, tired smile. He was always polite, the neighbor said. Didn't talk much, but he kept to himself. Loved his kids. Used to sit out front with them and eat ice cream. Inside, police found handwritten notes placed in careful positions, one in the hallway, another in the kitchen. Each was written in Barton's unmistakable, meticulous handwriting. In them, he described a deteriorating mental state, spoke vaguely of his losses, and alluded to his belief that the world had turned against him. There were religious references, mentions of cleansing and peace, all delivered with a cold finality that suggested he had made peace with the horror long before anyone else knew it existed. What truly struck investigators was the level of planning. He had made arrangements, paid off bills, emptied accounts, wrote letters to friends. This wasn't a snap decision. It was premeditated, shaped in silence over weeks, maybe months. And yet, no one saw it coming. I spoke to one of the detectives on the case a few weeks later, after the investigation had begun to wind down. We met at a diner south of the city, and he told me something I'll never forget. "We always assume monsters look like monsters," he said, stirring his coffee. "But sometimes they smile. They pay their taxes. They pick up their kids from school." That was the part of the story that chilled people the most, not just the tragedy, but the camouflage. How easily Barton had worn the mask of normalcy. His co-workers didn't suspect. His neighbors didn't suspect. Even his extended family hadn't sensed anything unusual. The notes he left behind didn't offer justification. They offered rationalization. In them, Barton portrayed himself as a man who had simply run out of options. He saw his actions not as violence, but as release. That distortion of reality, how a person could bend their mind around something so unthinkable and call it mercy, was what disturbed people to their core. Back at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, we were flooded with reader letters. Some were angry, some devastated. A few were from former colleagues of Barton, sharing little memories, mostly harmless. He always had that same ham sandwich for lunch. He liked to talk about his kids. He used to joke that he should have stuck to chemistry. Harmless on the surface. But in hindsight, every tiny moment became a clue, a thread we wished we'd pulled sooner. One particularly heartbreaking letter came from a former teacher of his son, Matthew. She described him as gentle and bright, a boy who once stayed after school to help her carry art supplies to her car. He had his whole life ahead of him, she wrote, and now it's like he was erased. Erased. That word haunted me, because that was exactly what Barton had done. Not just committed crimes, but attempted to erase his life and everyone in it. as if the failure of his dream justified the destruction of others. It was more than a story. It was a mirror, and as reporters, citizens, and human beings, we were all left asking ourselves, how did we miss the signs? In the days that followed, Atlanta's skyline remained the same, bright towers of glass reflecting the Georgia sun, but the people walking beneath them moved differently. There was a tension in the air, subtle but inescapable, like the quiet after a thunderclap. Something unspoken had shifted. Mark Barton's story had spread far beyond city limits. National media outlets had descended upon Atlanta, staking out at the scene of every major event. The Alltech and Momentum offices in Buckhead, the Stockbridge apartment complex, and the roadside motel in Ackworth. The narrative had gone from financial shooter to family tragedy, to something far more complex and disturbing. By August, the headlines weren't just recounting what had happened, they were trying to understand it. News anchors, psychologists, economists, and pastors all took their turn. Some blamed the culture of day trading, a volatile environment that attracted people desperate for control. Others pointed to untreated mental illness, financial stress, or Barton's unresolved past. A few even questioned how a man connected to a still unsolved double homicide in 1993, his former wife and mother-in-law, had managed to rebuild his life and go undetected for so long. For law enforcement, the Barton case became a chilling study in missed opportunities. Investigators reopened the 1993 case in Alabama, but the damage had already been done. Without new forensic evidence, and with Barton gone, no new charges could be brought. Only regrets and silence. But it was the financial world, specifically the community of independent traders, who seemed most shaken. I attended a gathering at a small trading club in Marietta a week after the attacks. It was a group of about 20 men and women who had been meeting every Thursday for over a year, sharing tips, comparing strategies, and working through the highs and lows of the market. Most of them had known Barton casually. A few had even sat next to him at Alltech on occasion. One trader, a man named Joel, mid-50s, lean, sharp-eyed, spoke candidly. I remember him sitting there, quiet as a ghost, watching the tickers. He didn't talk unless you asked him something, but he always answered like he had something to prove. Another woman chimed in. He was too hard on himself. You'd see it in his face when he lost money. Not just disappointed, ashamed. What stuck with me was how these people, strangers to each other just months before, now clung together like survivors of a storm. They weren't just mourning the loss of colleagues. They were mourning a belief that the worst thing a market could do was take your money. Now they knew better. It could take everything. The SEC and other regulatory bodies soon came under fire. Critics asked why traders like Barton, people who were clearly suffering financial and psychological breakdowns, were given such easy access to risky tools. Why there were no psychological screenings. Why there was no oversight once losses piled up. But these were systemic problems, deep-rooted, hard to fix. I started to realize, as I spoke to more people, that Barton's story wasn't just about one man's descent. It was a cautionary tale about illusion, about how we measure success, how we tie our self-worth to money, control, image. He had built his entire identity on being smart, successful, capable. When that identity crumbled, he didn't know who he was anymore. And in that confusion, he made choices that none of us can ever fully understand. And then there were the children. I attended the memorial service for Matthew and Michelle Barton in early August. It was held in a small church in McDonough, with more than 200 people packed into pews. Classmates, teachers, family, friends. The pastor didn't mention their father by name, but he didn't have to. The focus was on the lives that had been lost, their laughter, their joy, the stories that would never be told. Michelle's best friend stood up and read a letter she'd written. She liked unicorns and painting and dancing in the hallway. I wish we had more time to dance. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. In that moment, the case wasn't about trading platforms or law enforcement missteps or media coverage. It was about two young lives that should have stretched far into the future. School dances, graduations, road trips, first loves. All gone. The grief was raw, real. It cut through every professional boundary I had as a journalist. And I realized something else that day. Some stories stay with you not because of the facts, but because of the absence they leave behind. In the weeks after the memorials ended and the headlines faded from the national front pages, those of us in Atlanta were left to confront what had been left behind. Not in the form of police tape or camera crews, but in memory. In silence. In the changed way people looked at strangers. It was during this quieter time that I was able to speak with one of the surviving employees from Momentum Securities. She didn't want her name published. For the sake of this account, I'll call her Carla. We met in a small diner off Cheshire Bridge Road. She sat across from me, eyes ringed with exhaustion, hands trembling slightly even when wrapped around a coffee mug. She had been in the break room when Barton entered Momentum that Thursday. She heard the noise before she understood what it was. In that moment, like many others that day, she believed it was a firecracker or some kind of construction mishap from a nearby office. But when the second sound came, then the third, everything froze. People screamed, she said, her voice dry and even. And then everything went quiet. Just this weird, unnatural quiet. I stayed under the table. I don't know why I didn't move. Maybe because I couldn't. She told me that Barton never entered the break room. Had he chosen to, her story might have ended there. But fate, or timing, kept her alive. In the days after, she found herself unable to go back to work. She tried, twice, but her hands would start shaking the moment she walked into a building with glass walls. I thought I knew who Mark was, she whispered. We used to talk about movies. One time we shared an Uber. He told me about his kids. The disbelief hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened into something harder to hold, a loss of certainty. A fracture in the belief that you can ever really know the people sitting beside you every day. That's something I heard again and again during that time, from coworkers, friends, neighbors. The question wasn't only how could he, but also how could we not have known? That question haunted law enforcement too. Detectives with the Henry County Police Department and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation conducted a comprehensive post-mortem analysis of Barton's mental state. They combed through his financial records, tracked his trades, even consulted forensic psychologists. The picture that emerged was of a man increasingly cornered by personal failure and financial collapse. His stock losses weren't just heavy, they were disastrous. Investigators discovered that Barton had overdrawn multiple accounts, borrowed against what little he had left, and stopped paying his rent weeks before the murders. But unlike many others who spiral under financial pressure, Barton never reached out for help. There were no therapy visits, no financial consultations. He internalized everything, treating every failure as a personal indictment rather than a circumstance. The psychologist I interviewed, Dr. Evelyn Nash from Emory University, explained it like this. Mark Barton didn't experience loss the way most people do. He experienced it as rejection. When the market rejected him, he felt worthless. When his family saw his distress, he interpreted it as judgment. His reality had narrowed to a point where violence began to look, to him, like escape. Her words chilled me, not because they excused anything, nothing could, but because they revealed something more unsettling. Barton had never planned to live through July 27th. He had crafted his actions not just with intent, but with a sense of finality. His notes were farewells. His careful arrangements at home, the way he organized documents, made sure his children's school materials were stacked in neat piles. These weren't random acts of a man in crisis. They were acts of someone who had decided his story was over. And perhaps more terrifying, he had decided to end other stories with his own. Public debate began to stir. Talk radio stations hosted segments about mental health and male suicide. State lawmakers introduced proposals to increase mental health awareness within high-stress professions, including finance and law enforcement. Even the day trading firms, many of which had largely ignored their employees' personal well-being, began offering counseling services and implementing new internal policies around crisis prevention. But for those most affected, no policy would undo the trauma. No bill could bring back what had been lost. I reached out to Barton's surviving extended family, including a cousin who lived in South Carolina. She declined to speak at first. When she finally returned my call, her voice was cautious and slow. She told me that the family had been devastated, not just by the actions, but by the realization that they hadn't seen the unraveling either. I think he always carried something inside, she said. From when he was young, there was a sadness in him. I just thought he was tired, or lonely. I never thought he was lost. That was the word that kept coming back. Lost. Not mad, not evil, just lost, so deeply, so completely, that no one could reach him in time. But the tragedy of Mark Barton wasn't just that he was lost. It was that he took so many people with him. It was late August when I visited the Stockbridge apartment again. The crime scene tape had been removed. The doors had been sealed. But the building still stood there like a silent witness, part of a neighborhood that had returned to its quiet routines. even as shadows lingered over the lawn and pavement. A few doors down, a child's plastic wagon was tipped on its side, one wheel half buried in the grass. I stared at it longer than I probably should have, trying to picture the Barton children in motion, running down the sidewalk, calling out to their mother. You start to realize that the most painful thing about stories like this isn't the horror. It's the ordinariness that came before it. What struck me most over those weeks wasn't just the tragedy of the act, but the aftershock, the way the ripples of Barton's choices reached people who had never met him, never heard his name, never set foot in a trading office or suburb south of Atlanta. I received letters from people as far as Washington and Oregon, teachers, therapists, veterans, and parents, all trying to process what it meant for someone to hide so much beneath the surface. One woman wrote, "I look at my neighbor now and wonder, are you okay? And I never used to ask. Now I think we all should." That sentiment echoed everywhere, a growing awareness that people suffer in silence, sometimes invisibly, until something breaks. Barton wasn't a warning about markets or mental health in isolation. He was a warning about the cost of disconnection. At the core of this story, beneath the police reports, interviews, and public outrage, was a man who collapsed inward. He didn't shout. He didn't cry for help. He folded. And because he did it quietly, we missed it. In time, the offices at Alltech and Momentum reopened. Momentum moved its operations to a new building near Sandy Springs. Alltech eventually merged with another firm and rebranded entirely. The names on the doors changed, the logos disappeared, but for those who had been there that day, the memory remained embedded in the floors, in the layout of rooms, in the way the air still felt off when the blinds were pulled down. I met one survivor, Jeffrey R., a junior trader who had escaped the office only minutes before the shooting began. He was 24 at the time, barely out of college. I found him years later through an alumni newsletter and asked if he'd speak with me. We met in Piedmont Park, where he walked slowly through the trails, hands in his pockets, pausing only once to sit on a bench near the lake. His voice was quiet, not broken, but distant, like someone telling a story about another life. "I used to believe in second chances," he told me, "that anyone can get their life together if they try hard enough. But Barton, he made me question that. He looked like a man who wanted a second chance. But maybe he didn't." Jeffrey had since left the world of trading. He was now a math teacher in Gwinnett County. I asked him if that choice had anything to do with what happened that day. He nodded. "I think I wanted to do something that felt safe. Something that made sense. Numbers do that. Kids do that." I realized then that healing doesn't always look like heroism. Sometimes it looks like survival. Quiet, personal, and incomplete. For many of those connected to the Barton case, healing didn't come with answers. It came with time, with distance, with choosing to live differently. And yet, the story still lingers. Even today, there are those who won't speak Mark Barton's name. Not out of fear, but refusal. They don't want to give him power. They choose instead to remember the victims, the workers who didn't come home, the children who never got to grow up, the loved ones who carry their absence like a hidden scar. I think that's the hardest part for anyone trying to write about cases like this, knowing that the story we tell will never capture the full truth. It can't, because the truth isn't just in what happened. It's in what didn't. The conversations that never took place. The warnings never spoken. The help never offered or never accepted. Mark Barton wasn't a monster from the start. He was a man, a father, a colleague, a neighbor, and then one day he wasn't. By early September, the weather in Atlanta had begun to shift, humidity giving way to crisp mornings and a softer sky. The city was returning to its rhythm. Schools were in session, traffic was thick again, and most people moved through their days without mention of July 27th. But for the families of those lost, time had not moved forward. At Alltech and Momentum, 9 employees had died. Their names were read at a city-organized vigil held in Woodruff Park just before Labor Day. Alan Charles, a Dean Delk, Kevin Dial, Edward Quinn, a Janice Weiss, a Russell Brown, Joseph Jeske, a Scott Webb, Christopher Smith. Each name was followed by a bell chime. I stood at the edge of the crowd that day, journalist's notebook tucked under my arm, unsure if I was there as a reporter or just another citizen trying to understand how a single person's despair could echo so violently. The families sat in a quiet row beneath the shade of oaks. Some held framed photos. Others clutched folded programs. One woman, the sister of Christopher Smith, held his old trading badge, laminated and cracked at the edges. She didn't cry. She stared straight ahead. What struck me most was that none of the speeches mentioned Mark Barton. Not once. The event wasn't for him. It wasn't about understanding why. It was about honoring who. The people who showed up for work that morning expecting nothing more than a typical Thursday. The people who had families, routines, little joys. One victim had been planning his wedding. Another had just adopted a dog. One had sent an email about lunch options 10 minutes before everything changed. And for every person lost, there were dozens more left behind. Parents, spouses, siblings, friends. Each with an empty chair, an unanswered phone, a future permanently altered. I remember one woman, a Momentum secretary named Lana, who spoke at the vigil. She had worked with 3 of the victims and was out running an errand when the attack happened. Her voice shook as she read from a paper. I still check my phone for messages I'll never get. I still think I hear their laughter down the hall. People tell me I'm lucky. I wasn't in the building, but I don't feel lucky. I feel left behind. Survivor's guilt is a quiet thing. It doesn't show up in autopsy reports or crime scene photos, but it lingers in routines, in dreams, in the sound of keys unlocking a door that someone else never got to return to. Over the following weeks, I interviewed grief counselors, trauma specialists, and even church leaders who had supported the victims' families. One pastor, Reverend Michael Heron, said something I've never forgotten. The violence lasted minutes, but the grief will last generations. He wasn't exaggerating. These events don't end when the sirens stop. They ripple through time, reshaping how people trust, how they work, how they sleep. One of the victims' children, just 10 years old, refused to go back to school for months. Another, a wife of a Momentum trader, told me she couldn't walk into an office building without trembling. She ended up quitting her job entirely. And then, of course, there were the conversations that families would never get to finish. The last words that were too ordinary to matter at the time, but suddenly carried unbearable weight. Don't forget your lunch. I'll be late tonight. Love you. I've reported on murders, robberies, kidnappings, but something about this case stayed in my chest. Maybe because it was so sudden, so complete. There was no build-up, no warning, no confrontation. Just a quiet man in a suit who walked into a building and changed dozens of lives without raising his voice. And maybe it stayed with me because deep down, we all want to believe that we would know, that we would see something, that we could stop it, but we didn't. And what followed wasn't just grief. It was a reckoning. Fall deepened in Georgia, and the story, at least in the headlines, began to fade. Other news took its place. Political scandals, sports scores, a new hurricane forming off the coast. But for many of us, especially those closest to the Barton tragedy, the end of media attention wasn't an end at all. It was the beginning of the long, slow process of reckoning. Several institutions began asking difficult questions. What had been missed, and how to ensure nothing like this would happen again. The financial firms, especially those involved in day trading, were the first to act. Alltech and Momentum Securities, under heavy scrutiny, were forced to re-examine their practices. Internal memos circulated outlining new mental health policies, stress assessments, and mandatory counseling availability for high-frequency traders. Some of it felt like corporate damage control, but some of it was genuine. I spoke with a regional manager from Alltech who had been in charge of Barton's office at one point. He agreed to talk anonymously. We didn't see the signs, he admitted. Or maybe we didn't want to. A trader having a bad month? That's normal. But when you lose that much and just sit there, quietly taking it, that should have been a flag. In response to public concern, several firms created programs for identifying high-risk emotional behavior, especially in traders who had suffered repeated large losses. It wasn't foolproof, but it was a start. More importantly, the state of Georgia moved to expand crisis intervention programs. A bipartisan initiative was introduced in the state legislature to fund suicide prevention resources and early intervention mental health services, not only for those in crisis, but for the family members and co-workers around them. The conversation had shifted. It was no longer just about Mark Barton. It was about every person who'd ever suffered silently. Every worker who broke down in a bathroom stall and pulled themselves together because there wasn't time. Every father who smiled for his kids while battling despair behind closed doors. But amidst the policy changes and institutional responses, it was the small, quiet acts of remembrance that moved me most. In late October, I was invited to a private event at a church in Decatur, organized by friends and co-workers of one of the victims, Janice Weiss. She had been a beloved office manager at Alltech, known for organizing potlucks and printing out quotes from inspirational books to tape near the office coffee machine. That night, the church fellowship hall was filled with candles. Her favorite music played softly: James Taylor, Cat Stevens, Simon and Garfunkel. People stood up to share memories. One man recalled how she brought extra sandwiches every Friday, just in case someone forgot theirs. Another described how she once stayed late to help a new intern prepare for his Series 7 exam, even though she had nothing to gain from it. There were tears, but there was laughter too. And that night, I realized something. The people Barton tried to erase were not gone. Their presence remained, in the stories, in the lessons, in the quiet kindnesses they had given the world. In the hallway of that church, someone had set up a table with photos of all 9 victims. Below the images, written in looping script on a long white banner, were the words, "We remember. We go on." And that's what Atlanta did. It went on, but not unchanged. You began to notice things. People greeted their co-workers a little more warmly. Offices scheduled mental health days. A few companies even hired counselors to walk the floor once a week. It wasn't always perfect, but the awareness was there now. The illusion that these things just happened to other people had shattered. And I think that's what made the Barton case so deeply unsettling. Not just the violence, but the way it pierced the everyday. This didn't happen in a back alley or a darkened street corner. It happened in office cubicles and family kitchens, in places that are supposed to be safe. I carried that with me, and so did Atlanta. 25 years have passed since the morning Mark Barton walked into 2 offices in Buckhead and altered the lives of dozens forever. Today, there are no plaques at the scene, no permanent public marker to say, something broke here. The buildings are still standing, but both have changed hands multiple times. A design firm occupies the former Momentum offices. Alteca's old space was absorbed by a multinational bank. Most who walk those halls today have never heard the name Mark Barton. They sip their coffee, check the markets, and answer emails, unaware of the blood that was once spilled on those very floors. But for those who lived through it, the echoes never left. I met with Russell Brown's daughter, Emily, last year. She was just a child when her father was taken. Now grown, a nurse living in Charlotte, she had agreed, reluctantly, to speak with me as part of a long-term follow-up I was working on for a journalism series about public grief. We met in a quiet coffee shop near her hospital. She wore a stethoscope around her neck, and her smile was weary but strong. "I still get angry," she told me. "Every July, I can feel it coming, but I also feel him with me, especially when I'm helping someone who's scared or hurting." He taught me that. I asked her what she remembered most about her father. She paused. "He used to tuck a sticky note in my lunchbox every day. Just one line. A joke. Or something like, 'Be brave, today's a good day.' I still have a few of them." She reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled Ziploc with 3 faded Post-it notes. One of them read, "You are stronger than you think." That strength, passed quietly from one generation to the next, is something no murderer can destroy. Not Barton, not anyone. And yet, the grief still lives in quiet places. In the family members who never got to say goodbye. In the co-workers who walked back into their offices and saw empty chairs. In the officers who responded to the scenes, who still remember the silence after the gunfire. In the therapists who counseled the survivors for years afterward. In the small, private memorials held in break rooms and church basements and backyards. For journalists like me, the story became a lens, one through which I began to see all violence, all tragedy, not in headlines, but in ripples. In the tiny ways loss shifts the ground under people's feet. I've covered wars and protests since then. Corruption, scandal, hurricanes. But Barton's story was the one that changed how I write. Not just because of what he did, but because of who he took. The son who loved dinosaurs. The daughter who wanted to be an artist. The woman who always remembered co-workers' birthdays. The trader who made everyone laugh during slow market days. The father who wrote notes to his little girl. The ordinary, everyday people who were simply living. And that's what makes stories like this so important. Not to glorify the killer. Not to sensationalize the crime. But to remember the people who were lost. And to remind the rest of us to listen harder, look closer, and never assume that silence means peace. In the end, the Barton case taught Atlanta, and perhaps the country, 2 hard truths. First, that tragedy doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the person across the hall, the one who seems quiet, reserved, fine. And second, that healing is never neat. It doesn't arrive in perfect stages. It's messy, uneven, personal, but it is possible. And sometimes, healing looks like a sticky note in a lunchbox. Sometimes it's a new law, a changed policy, a long overdue hug, a moment of silence where noise used to be. So no, the world didn't stop on July 27, 2000. But for many, something inside them did. And yet, life kept moving. A little more cautious, a little more aware, and maybe, just maybe, a little more kind. Story 3. It was a typical spring afternoon in Miami on April 25, 2000. The sun blazed down on the bustling streets, and the city hummed with its usual energy. I was seated at my desk at the Miami Herald, sifting through the day's stories when the call came in. "Janet's missing," a colleague said, her voice tinged with concern. Janet Acosta, a 49-year-old production supervisor, had been a fixture at the Herald for nearly 25 years. Known for her dedication and warm demeanor, her sudden disappearance was uncharacteristic. She had gone out for her lunch break, as she did every day, but hadn't returned. Her colleagues were immediately on edge. Janet was punctual, reliable, and always kept in touch. Her absence was more than just unusual, it was alarming. The police were notified, and an investigation was launched. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras revealed Janet's van parked in a secluded area. The doors were ajar, and her belongings were scattered around. There was no sign of a struggle, but the scene was unsettling. As the hours turned into days, hope began to wane. The Miami-Dade Police Department worked tirelessly, following every lead, interviewing potential witnesses, and canvassing the area. Yet, Janet remained missing. Then a breakthrough came. A man named Michael Anthony Tanzi was arrested in the Florida Keys. He was found in Janet's van, and her personal items were discovered in his possession. He was taken into custody and charged with kidnapping, robbery, and carjacking. Tanzi's arrest brought a glimmer of hope, but it was short-lived. Days later, Janet's body was discovered in a remote area of Cudjoe Key, a secluded part of the Florida Keys. She had been strangled, and the circumstances surrounding her death were both tragic and horrifying. The news sent shockwaves through the community. Janet was not just a colleague. She was a friend, a mother, a sister. Her untimely death left a void that could never be filled. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Tanzi had a history of violent behavior. He had been previously convicted of crimes in other states and had a pattern of targeting women. His actions were not impulsive, they were calculated and deliberate. The case garnered national attention, and the media descended upon Miami. The story of Janet Acosta, a beloved newspaper employee, and the man who took her life, captivated audiences across the country. In the following pages, we will delve deeper into the investigation, the trial, and the aftermath of this tragic event. We will explore the impact on Janet's family and colleagues, the legal proceedings that followed, and the broader implications for the community. But for now, as the sun set over Miami, all that remained was the memory of a woman who had been taken too soon and the haunting question, why? As the days passed without any sign of Janet Acosta, the sense of urgency among her colleagues and the Miami-Dade Police Department intensified. The surveillance footage from nearby cameras had shown her van parked in a secluded area with the doors ajar, but there were no signs of a struggle. The lack of evidence left investigators with few leads. The breakthrough came when a local resident reported seeing a man matching the description of the suspect near the area where Janet's van was found. The police acted swiftly, canvassing the neighborhood and gathering information. It wasn't long before they received a tip that would change the course of the investigation. A man named Michael Anthony Tanzi had been spotted driving Janet's van in the Florida Keys. Authorities were alerted, and a manhunt ensued. Tanzi, a drifter from Massachusetts, had a history of criminal behavior and was known to have been in the area around the time of Janet's disappearance. The police tracked Tanzi to a remote area in the Keys, where they found him in possession of Janet's personal belongings, including her ATM card. He was arrested and brought in for questioning. During the interrogation, Tanzi initially denied any involvement in Janet's disappearance. However, As investigators presented the evidence against him, he began to crack. He eventually confessed to the crime in detail, describing how he had abducted Janet during her lunch break, assaulted her, and then drove her to the Florida Keys. Tansey led the police to the location where he had disposed of Janet's body, a secluded area in Cudjoe Key. The discovery of her remains brought a sense of closure to her family and colleagues, but it also revealed the horrific nature of the crime. The legal proceedings that followed were swift. Tansey was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, carjacking, armed robbery, and sexual assault. He was held without bond as the case moved through the court system. In January 2003, Tansey pleaded guilty to all charges without a plea bargain. The following month, he was sentenced to death by the Monroe County Circuit Court. The judge, Richard Payne, emphasized the brutality of the crime and the calculated nature of Tansey's actions in delivering the sentence. The case garnered national attention, not only because of the heinous nature of the crime, but also due to Tansey's background and previous criminal activities. He had a history of violent behavior and had been previously convicted of crimes in other states. His actions in this case were seen as part of a disturbing pattern. As the years passed, Tansey's legal team filed numerous appeals, challenging the conviction and the death sentence. They argued that he had not received a fair trial and that new evidence had come to light that could exonerate him. However, each appeal was denied, and the courts upheld the original verdict. In April 2025, after more than 2 decades of legal battles, Michael Anthony Tansey was scheduled to be executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. The execution was carried out on April 8, 2025, marking the culmination of a long and painful journey for Janet Acosta's family and the Miami community. The execution brought a sense of finality to the case, but it also left lingering questions about the justice system and the long road to accountability. Janet Acosta's death had a profound impact on those who knew her, and her memory continues to serve as a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of seeking justice. The morning after Janet's body was discovered in Cudjoe Key, the newsroom at the Miami Herald was silent. Not the usual silence of focused typing or ringing phones muffled behind cubicle walls, but the heavy, unspoken kind. The kind that hangs in the air like fog, pressing down on everyone in the room. Janet had been more than a colleague. She had been a constant. A mother figure to some, a confidant to others, and for many, the glue that held their chaotic days together. I remember walking into the break room, the coffee pot still half full, her favorite blue mug still sitting on the shelf. Someone had placed a small white flower next to it. No one had to say who it was for. Grief moved through the building like a tide, unpredictable and overwhelming. Some of the younger interns wept openly. The older editors sat at their desks, staring blankly at screens. Her desk was untouched. Her calendar still marked lunch with Sarah for April 25th, the day she never came back. In those early days, I found myself gravitating toward her friends, trying to gather more about the woman we had lost. Her best friend at the paper, Elena Morales, spoke to me. One afternoon after work, we sat outside near Biscayne Bay, the breeze carrying the faint smell of salt and jasmine. She was the kind of person who would listen, really listen, Elena said, her voice shaking. Not just nod while you talked. She would look at you like what you said mattered. Like you mattered. Elena paused, wiping her eyes. She used to say, "You never know what someone's carrying. So be kind. Always." That kindness made Janet's death feel even more senseless. That someone so gentle, so fundamentally good, could be taken in such a brutal, random act. It tore at the soul of the newsroom. It made us question things we'd never questioned before. Our safety, our assumptions, and the very structure of trust in our daily lives. The Miami Herald held a memorial service the following week in the building's main atrium. Dozens of staff members, past and present, showed up. Her family came. Her sister Maria flew in from New Jersey, her adult son David from Texas. He stood at the podium, holding a framed photo of his mother smiling on a beach. "I never thought I'd have to speak at something like this," he began, his voice uneven. "But I want to say this. My mom loved this paper. She loved all of you, and she deserved better." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. What followed in the coming weeks was an outpouring of community support. Flowers arrived at the Herald every morning. The staff received letters from readers across Florida, people who had never met Janet, but who recognized something universal in the loss. The randomness of tragedy, the fragility of life. The editorial board published a full-page tribute the following Sunday, titled "For Janet." a light gone too soon. It wasn't just an obituary. It was a testament to the lives touched by one woman's everyday grace. In parallel, the investigation into Tansy's background grew deeper and more disturbing. As I reviewed court documents and spoke with detectives, a clearer portrait emerged. Tansy had been released from a Massachusetts prison only a short time before the crime. He had violated parole, bounced between states, and slipped through systemic cracks that allowed him to cross state lines without proper supervision. A veteran detective in the case, Detective Luis Ramos, met with me in a downtown diner to share what he could. He was what we call a migratory predator, Ramos explained, flipping through a worn notebook. No real ties, no family watching him, no job. He blended in, picked his moment, and moved fast. By the time we had the ATM surveillance images, he was already halfway to the keys. Tansy had used Janet's ATM card at multiple stops during his flight, once even buying fast food and gasoline. It was through those transactions that the authorities were able to track his route, like breadcrumbs leading to a devastating end. For the people closest to Janet, this information wasn't just shocking, it was infuriating. How does someone like that just walk around free? Maria Acosta asked me during a phone interview, how is someone that dangerous allowed to get that close to my sister? Her question haunted me, because she wasn't just asking about the man, she was asking about the system. And beneath the grief, the pain, and the funerals, that was the wound that would take longest to heal. By late summer 2000, the name Michael Anthony Tansy had become a fixture in South Florida headlines. The media labeled him everything from drifter to cold-blooded predator. But inside the Monroe County Courthouse, there was no room for labels, only facts, testimony, and the slow machinery of justice grinding into motion. The courtroom sat heavy with tension during the preliminary hearings. Tansy appeared gaunt, his expression unreadable, flanked by two public defenders. Across the aisle, Maria Acosta sat quietly in the front row, wearing a dark blouse and clutching a rosary that had once belonged to her sister. Her son David sat beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the man who had taken his mother. I was granted access to the courtroom as a press observer. The moment I stepped into the gallery, I felt it. The electric mix of grief and fury that radiated from the rows of family members, co-workers, even members of the public who had come to witness justice in action. The state's case was devastatingly straightforward. Prosecutor Elaine Morales, a veteran with a reputation for methodical argument, laid out the timeline. April 25, 2000, Janet Acosta exits the Miami Herald during her lunch break. She enters her van. She never returns. Over the next 48 hours, her credit and ATM cards are used repeatedly. Surveillance footage shows Tansy at each location. He is arrested in the Florida Keys with Janet's personal belongings in his possession. Eventually, he leads authorities to her body. But it wasn't just the evidence that gripped the courtroom. It was the tone of Tansy's confession. When the taped interview was played, many couldn't bear to watch. Tansy's voice was flat, chilling in its lack of remorse. I didn't know her. I just needed a car. It got out of hand. As if a human life could simply spiral out of hand. Maria left the courtroom during that portion of the testimony. David stayed, his hands balled into fists in his lap. Tansy's defense attorney, Paul Reagan, attempted to construct a narrative of mental instability. He cited childhood trauma, drug addiction, emotional neglect, and a lack of proper psychiatric care after his release from a Massachusetts prison. While not excusing the crime, Reagan argued, these circumstances painted Tansy as a damaged individual, not a calculating killer. But no one in the room seemed moved by it. Not when the autopsy report was read aloud. Not when the lead detective described the condition in which Janet's body had been found. Not when the jury was shown photographs, sanitized but still unbearable, of the site in Cudjoe Key where she had been dumped like garbage. What lingered through the trial wasn't just the brutal facts. It was the gaps, the holes in the system that allowed someone like Tansy to slip from one jurisdiction to another without adequate monitoring. He'd violated parole. He'd faced minor charges in multiple counties, none of which were flagged or followed up in a way that might have stopped him. Janet Acosta paid the price for that negligence. During closing arguments, Prosecutor Morales said it plainly. This isn't just a case about a man and a victim. This is about accountability. If we don't hold this man fully responsible, then what message are we sending? That a woman's life can be taken in the middle of the day, in front of the world, and all we do is wring our hands. The jury took less than 2 hours to deliver their verdict, guilty on all counts. At sentencing, Tansy declined to make a statement. He stared at the table, his hands motionless. He had pleaded guilty earlier in the process, perhaps hoping for leniency. He would find none. Judge Richard Payne delivered the sentence with precision. Death by lethal injection. In the courtroom, there was no celebration. No cheers. Just silence. A silence heavier than any I'd heard before. Because even justice doesn't bring people back. Outside, reporters swarmed Maria and David. They made only a brief statement. He took her from us. He took everything. But he doesn't get to take our peace, Maria said. David simply added, "We'll carry her forward." As Tansy was escorted from the courtroom in shackles, I remember looking at him. This man whose choices had rippled out and devastated so many lives. He looked tired, blank, as if the outcome no longer mattered. But it did. To Janet, to her family, to all of us. The law had spoken, but grief has no such voice. It lingers, quiet and unfinished. In the months following Michael Tansy's conviction and sentencing, life in Miami appeared to move forward. The city never really stops. Its rhythm, bustling streets, sirens in the distance, children playing under the palm trees, carries on regardless of grief. But if you looked closely, you could see the places where the fabric had frayed. At the Miami Herald, the newsroom adjusted slowly. Janet's desk, once adorned with photos of her son, a ceramic owl, and sticky notes covered in neat cursive, was eventually cleared. But it wasn't reassigned. Her chair remained empty, an unspoken memorial. Staff would still pause near it, some unconsciously reaching for her old drawer before catching themselves. I remember speaking with Carlos Rivera, a senior editor who'd worked with Janet for over a decade. We met for coffee a few blocks from the Herald office, weeks after the sentencing. "You want to know what changed?" he said, stirring his drink slowly. "People don't go to the parking lot alone anymore. We used to stay late without thinking twice. Now everyone checks in, walks in pairs. You can feel it in the bones of the building." The Herald instituted new security protocols after Janet's death. Staff ID badges were upgraded, and a guard was stationed near the parking area during shift changes. Self-defense workshops were offered. It felt like progress, but also like an admission that they hadn't protected one of their own. But the grief wasn't confined to the walls of the Herald. In Liberty City, where Janet had volunteered on weekends teaching reading classes to at-risk youth, her absence was deeply felt. I visited the community center, where she'd given her time. Her photo had been framed near the front entrance, beneath a handwritten message in crayon. "Ms. Janet helped me find my voice. Tasha, age 12. The center held a small remembrance event in her honor, and I attended as a quiet observer. The kids, many of whom had only known her for months, remembered her as someone who listened, smelled like vanilla, and always said you could be anything. One of the volunteers, a woman named Darnell, approached me afterward. "You don't know what that woman gave these kids," she said. "They got enough people walking away from them. She stayed. She showed up." In those moments, the enormity of what had been lost felt impossible to measure. Meanwhile, conversations were happening at a much higher level. State policy makers, law enforcement agencies, and criminal justice advocates were scrutinizing the systems that had failed so catastrophically. Tansy's criminal record, his parole violations, his unchecked movement between states, all of it revealed a pattern of bureaucratic disconnects. Miami's mayor at the time, Julio Chavez, called for a state audit of how parole violators were tracked and managed. His press conference, held just steps from the Miami-Dade courthouse, carried a pointed tone. This tragedy was not just the result of one man's evil. It was a systemic collapse. And if we don't fix what failed Janet Acosta, then we fail every other Floridian who counts on us to keep them safe. Public pressure intensified. Newspapers, including ours, began publishing editorials calling for reform. The Florida Department of Corrections was pushed to review its communication protocols with out-of-state agencies. Within a year, a new pilot program was launched to implement real-time data, sharing on parolee status across jurisdictions. Some called it the Acosta response. But even with reform, with policy change, and with the justice system seemingly doing its job, something remained unresolved. Something deeper than law. I visited Janet's sister again that November. Maria Acosta had returned to New Jersey, but flew down periodically to help manage a literacy fund established in her sister's name. We met at a small Cuban cafe Janet had loved. "People think justice ends things," she told me, tapping her fingers against her teacup. "But grief isn't a line. It's a circle. You come back to it again and again." She paused. The hard part isn't the day you bury them. It's every ordinary day after, when you realize they're not coming back for the little things, the birthdays, the Sunday calls, the stupid jokes. We talked until the cafe emptied. When we parted, she pressed a folded note into my hand. It was a copy of one of Janet's favorite quotes, scrawled in faded ink. "Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about." That sentence would follow me for years. Janet Acosta's death had torn something open, not just in a family, not just in a city, but in the collective illusion that bad things only happen in the shadows. What Tansy did wasn't just murder, it was an invasion. Of safety, of routine, of belief. The community mourned. It responded. It changed. But the sense of loss didn't fade. It adapted. It became part of Miami's invisible history, a page in its long story of resilience, heartbreak, and the quiet strength of those who remain. After the trial ended and the cameras stopped flashing, Michael Anthony Tansy was transported to Florida State Prison in Rayford, a stark, aging complex in northern Florida, where the state's death row inmates live in near total isolation. For most Floridians, he vanished from public consciousness the moment the gavel fell. But for those closest to Janet, his presence lingered. It lived in letters from the Florida Department of Corrections detailing each of Tansy's appeals. It lived in court dates that came and went with little fanfare but reopened old wounds every time. It lived in the fear that he might one day escape his sentence, not by pardon, but by the slow erosion of time and bureaucracy. Tansy's time on death row followed a now familiar rhythm in capital cases. A series of appeals, petitions, and motions intended to delay the inevitable. In 2004, his legal team filed a direct appeal to the Florida Supreme Court, claiming ineffective assistance of counsel and mental illness that had been overlooked during the original trial. His attorneys argued that Tansy had suffered years of untreated bipolar disorder, childhood abuse, and trauma stemming from a fractured family life in Massachusetts. They portrayed a man who had fallen through every crack the system could offer. But the facts remained brutal and unchanged. Janet Acosta had been abducted in broad daylight. She had been held against her will, driven for hours, and ultimately murdered in cold blood. Tansy had confessed without coercion. He had led authorities to the crime scene. The Florida Supreme Court upheld the conviction and death sentence in 2006. Still, the appeals didn't stop. Over the years, Tansy's defense team launched multiple post-conviction motions, including one in 2010 alleging new psychiatric evidence. Another in 2014 claimed procedural errors in jury selection. Each was reviewed, each was denied. For those unfamiliar with the death penalty process, the glacial pace can seem baffling, even unjust. But capital cases move slowly for a reason. The margin for error is razor thin, and no state wants to be the one that executes the wrong person. For David Acosta, Janet's son, the process was agonizing. "This isn't closure," he said in a 2015 interview with WPLG Miami. "It's reliving the trauma every few years. And every time I have to hear his name, I lose a little bit more of my peace." David became an advocate for victims' rights, speaking at events and writing editorials urging the justice system to do more, not just to convict, but to care for the people left behind. He never campaigned for vengeance. He wanted efficiency, compassion, finality. Meanwhile, in academic circles and state legislatures, Tansy's case was quietly cited in debates over the morality and efficacy of capital punishment. Some saw it as a textbook justification for the death penalty, a confessed murderer, a crime of staggering cruelty, a clear and present danger to society. Others saw a man born into dysfunction, shuffled through prisons and psychiatric facilities, never given the support he needed before exploding in an act of irreversible violence. For the Acosta family, those debates were infuriating. "We don't need to romanticize him," Maria Acosta once told me in a follow-up conversation. "He had choices, and one of those choices ended my sister's life." Over the years, Janet's name faded from headlines but remained etched in community memory. Her former colleagues at the Herald established a scholarship fund in her name, supporting young women pursuing careers in journalism. The Liberty City Reading Center, where she volunteered, renamed its children's library the Janet Acosta Learning Room. Every year on the anniversary of her death, a small group gathered outside the Miami Herald to light candles in her honor. Some were friends, some were strangers, some simply remembered the feeling of loss that swept through the city that April. One year, I was approached by a woman named Karen Beecham, who had worked as a temp in the building when Janet was abducted. "I barely knew her," she said, placing a flower near the gate. "But I'll never forget the way everyone talked about her. Like she was sunlight. You don't forget sunlight." Time moved forward, but the story never really ended. In 2023, after more than 2 decades of appeals and denials, the Florida Supreme Court denied Tanzi's final post-conviction relief motion, clearing the last legal hurdle for execution. The state set a formal execution date for April 8, 2025. Janet's family was notified. They would be offered seats in the witness chamber, though the decision to attend was deeply personal. "I don't know if I'll go," David said in a TV interview. "I've carried this for 25 years. I'm tired. I just want to live in a world where she's remembered for how she lived, not how she died." That spring, the media returned to the story with renewed intensity. News crews camped outside Florida State Prison. Editorials resurfaced, both for and against capital punishment. The cycle had begun again. But beneath the headlines, beneath the legal jargon, the politics, and the philosophical divides, one truth remained untouched. A woman named Janet Acosta had lived, and she had mattered. The system tried, in its way, to right the wrong. Whether it succeeded, well, that depends on what you believe justice looks like. But for her family, her friends, and those of us who bore witness to it all, the question had never really been about justice. It was always about memory, and love, and the stubborn refusal to let one violent moment define an entire life. The last week of March 2025 passed in a haze of spring heat and anxious quiet. In northern Florida, the air around Florida State Prison was heavy, damp, and thick with expectation. The white limestone walls of the facility stood impassively against the hum of helicopters and news vans assembling at the perimeter. Inside, final preparations for Michael Anthony Tanzi's execution were already underway. By law, the condemned were allowed a final 30-day notification of their execution date. For Tanzi, that notification had arrived on March 8, 25 years after Janet Acosta was abducted. His appeals had all been denied. The state was proceeding. I traveled to Rayford as both a reporter and an observer, assigned by the Herald to document the final chapter of a story that had never truly left the newsroom. Outside the prison, a growing crowd of protesters and supporters gathered behind temporary barricades. On one side stood those chanting for abolition of the death penalty, waving signs that read "execution is not justice" and "compassion, not death." On the other stood people in quiet support of the Acosta family, holding framed photos of Janet or wearing pins with her initials, J.A. The night before the execution, I met with Maria Acosta at a quiet hotel just outside Gainesville. She sat on the edge of a stiff couch, her fingers folded tightly in her lap. "I never imagined I'd be here," she said quietly. "I always thought justice would feel like something, a release. But all I feel is tired." Maria had decided not to attend the execution. Her son, David, had chosen otherwise. "It's not about hate," he'd told me in a phone call earlier that week. "I need to see it end. I need to watch the state finish what it promised." On April 8, 2025, the execution was scheduled for 6 p.m. sharp. By law, Florida allows the victim's family to attend from a small, separate witness chamber behind a one-way glass pane. David arrived shortly before 5:30, accompanied by a grief counselor and a chaplain. He was pale but resolute. Tanzi had spent his final day in Q Wing, the section of the prison reserved for death row inmates. He was allowed a last meal, for which he requested a cheeseburger, fries, and a slice of chocolate cake, a final act of normalcy before the end. He had declined all interviews in his final month. No final confessions, no apologies. He would die as he had lived for 25 years in prison, withdrawn, silent, and many believed unmoved. At 5:55 p.m., witnesses were ushered into their designated chambers. I was one of 5 media representatives permitted into the press viewing room, a long, narrow space with a pane of bulletproof glass separating us from the sterile execution chamber beyond. Tanzi entered at 6:02 p.m., flanked by guards. His orange jumpsuit was exchanged for a clean white gown. He looked thinner, older, with gray threaded through his hair and a look of profound detachment in his eyes. He made no eye contact with the glass. Not with the guards. Not with the warden. Not with David Acosta, seated silently behind the window. At 6:07 p.m., the warden read the official order of execution. Tanzi was asked if he had any last words. He said nothing. At 6:08 p.m., the first drug was administered, a sedative designed to render unconsciousness. His breathing slowed. His eyes closed. By 6:12, The second and third injections followed, paralytic and cardiac arrest agents. His chest stopped rising. At 6:17 p.m., a prison doctor entered, checked for vital signs, and pronounced Michael Anthony Tansey dead. The room remained silent. Even in death, he left behind no words. Afterward, I spoke briefly with David in the prison's grief processing room. A bare, concrete space with a coffee machine and a few brown chairs. "It didn't bring her back," he said, staring ahead. "It didn't fix anything, but it closed a door I've been standing in for half my life." He paused. She was light. He was darkness. That's what I saw tonight. Maria released a statement through the family's attorney that evening. "We have never wished for vengeance, only for accountability. Tonight, we do not celebrate a death. We mourn the loss of life, first Janet's, and now the life of a man who could have chosen differently. May peace find all who still hurt." Outside the prison gates, the crowd began to disperse. The protesters lowered their signs. Supporters said prayers and embraced. The news trucks packed up. The buzz quieted, and slowly, Rayford faded back into obscurity. But for those of us who had followed the story from the beginning, for those who remembered Janet's voice, her laugh, the way she treated people with genuine care, it was not the end. It was a footnote, a punctuation mark, one more line in a long, unfinished story. Because grief does not end when justice is served. It simply changes form. It becomes the echo of a voice on a voicemail no one deletes. The shape of a hand no longer there to hold. The blue coffee mug left behind on a shelf that no one dares to move. It becomes memory. And memory, as I would come to understand, is the only kind of justice that lasts. In the weeks following Michael Tansey's execution, the national conversation drifted on. News cycles moved to the next tragedy, the next headline, the next scandal. But in Miami, the name Janet Acosta still echoed, subtly, reverently, and with quiet persistence. For most of the city, April 8, 2025, marked the close of a chapter. For those who had loved her, it was only a new beginning. At the Miami Herald, a commemorative plaque was installed just outside the staff newsroom. It read, "In memory of Janet Elena Acosta, 1958 to 2000, whose dedication, kindness, and courage illuminated every corner of this newsroom. We remember her not for how she was taken, but for how she lived." Colleagues gathered on the afternoon it was unveiled. Some spoke, some cried, and some stood silently, sipping coffee from paper cups, their eyes distant. Her old desk remained unoccupied. A new intern, unaware of the full story, had once asked why. "She still works here," a senior editor replied, "just not in the way you think." Across town, in Liberty City, the Janet Acosta Learning Room was thriving. Each week, children from the neighborhood gathered in the small, colorful space, lined with books and hand-painted murals, to learn to read, to dream, to imagine a world larger than the one they knew. It was quiet, joyful work, largely unnoticed by the outside world. But it was the kind of work Janet had cared about most. I visited the center again that summer, sitting in on one of the Saturday sessions. A young girl named Tasha, now in high school, led a reading group for younger kids. She was bright, articulate, and wore a necklace with a tiny silver J on it. She helped me learn to read. Tasha told me, gesturing toward a photo of Janet near the bookshelf. "I want to do the same for someone else." It was in places like this, far from courtrooms and prisons, that her legacy felt most alive. But the impact of her life extended even further. The Acosta Memorial Scholarship Fund, established by her family and the Herald, had grown significantly over 2 decades. By 2025, it had awarded over $240,000 in scholarships to young women pursuing careers in journalism, law, and public service. Many of the recipients had never known Janet, but they carried her story with them like a quiet oath. One such recipient, Elise Martinez, wrote in her scholarship essay, "Janet Acosta believed in telling the truth, in helping others, and in standing up even when no one's looking. I may not have met her, but I hope to honor her with the work I do." Elise would go on to become a court reporter in Broward County, focusing on criminal justice reform. In 2026, the Florida Department of Corrections published a public report on interagency communication failures in parole monitoring, citing the Acosta case directly. It led to new statewide standards for parolee tracking and mental health intervention referrals. A small but important piece of Janet's legacy was etched into the fabric of policy. It wasn't headline-grabbing reform. It didn't come with speeches or ceremonies. But it mattered. In quieter corners, her memory found other forms. One Herald colleague, Mark Feldman, began a personal blog titled The People We Lose. Every month, he wrote about someone whose story had touched the city and disappeared too quickly from view. Janet was the first post. The blog gained a modest following, and to this day, people still leave comments on that first entry. She made my mom smile when she came to renew her classifieds. One comment read, "That's the only thing I remember, but it stayed with me." Another said, "I never met her, but I think of her every time I walk alone in a parking lot. She deserved better." We all do. Perhaps the most unexpected tribute came from Detective Luis Ramos, who retired in 2028. At his retirement ceremony, when asked about the case that had affected him most, he said simply, "Janet Acosta," because it wasn't just about catching someone. It was about everything we failed to stop before it happened, and everything we owed afterward. Years passed. New names took Janet's place in the news cycle, but her story remained carved into the city's collective memory, not as a cautionary tale, but as a quiet standard. She became, in many ways, a symbol of ordinary integrity. A woman who woke up, went to work, did her job well, treated people kindly, and died simply because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that, in the end, is what made her story so powerful. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was human. She could have been anyone. Your coworker, your neighbor, your mother, you. And so her story continues, carried not by headlines, but by the lives she touched. In whispers, in stories, in scholarships and reading rooms, and the lessons passed from one person to the next. Not as a victim, but as a reminder of kindness, of courage, of light. In the years after the execution, Maria Acosta found herself living in two separate worlds. There was the life she built in New Jersey, where she returned after her sister's funeral, a life of careful normalcy, filled with routines that gave her structure, morning coffee, her job at the public library, calls with her son David every Sunday. She kept the same modest apartment she'd had since 1997, and she rarely spoke of Janet outside of family. But in the other world, the one carved out by trauma, Maria remained tethered to Florida, to that April day in 2000, and to everything that followed. Her coping mechanism was writing. Not for publication, not for anyone else, but for herself. She filled 5 black-bound notebooks over 2 decades. Notes about grief, dreams in which Janet appeared, letters to her sister, dated and addressed to the sky. One entry, dated March 12, 2025, just before Tanzi's execution, read, "He will leave the earth next month. I don't feel better. I don't feel worse. I just feel empty in the space where rage used to be. I hope that means I'm healing." Maria eventually found a form of peace through quiet activism. She joined a support network for families of homicide victims, volunteering to speak, mostly in small, closed groups, about what it was like to navigate grief over such a long, unyielding arc. Her words were never rehearsed, never dramatic. They were just real, and real was exactly what people needed. Meanwhile, David Acosta, Janet's son, grew into the role of advocate, reluctantly at first, then with clarity and conviction. After witnessing the execution, he withdrew from public life for nearly a year. Friends said he traveled, somewhere quiet, maybe Colorado or Oregon. He deleted his social media accounts. He turned down all interview requests. Then slowly he returned. In 2026, David began working with a national nonprofit focused on post-trauma legal support, helping victims' families understand the complex processes surrounding violent crime cases. He used his experience, not as a weapon, but as a compass. He never raised his voice, said one colleague, but when he spoke, people listened, because he wasn't selling a theory. He was surviving a truth. He gave keynote addresses at conferences, led private workshops, and eventually became a key consultant in a Florida pilot program for trauma-informed judicial processes. His work earned him quiet recognition, but he never sought credit. What David never did, by choice, was return to Miami. "It's my mother's city," he once told a friend, "but I don't want to remember her in that parking lot. I want to remember her in her kitchen, in her garden, in the places that weren't touched by him." Colleagues from the Herald carried their own versions of remembrance. Some kept their grief private, others channeled it into journalism, covering courtrooms with more care, interviewing victims with more empathy, digging into policy with sharper resolve. Carlos Rivera, the editor who had spoken at her memorial, eventually retired in 2032. In his farewell column, he mentioned Janet only once, at the very end. "If you asked me what I learned in all these years, I'd say this. It's not the deadlines or the scoops you remember. It's the people, the ones who showed up every day without fanfare. Like Janet, she taught us how to be decent. And in this business, that's everything. The Reading Center in Liberty City evolved over time. In 2030, with the help of a state education grant, it expanded into a full after-school program, complete with mentorship, technology access, and college prep resources. They kept her name on the door. Each year, during a quiet spring ceremony, children would gather to read aloud letters they'd written to someone they admired. Janet was still mentioned, not because they remembered her, but because their teachers did, because her story was passed down like folklore. Ms. Acosta wasn't famous, one boy said during a 2031 ceremony. But she helped kids, and she didn't even have to. I want to be like that. The most personal tribute, however, came in 2034 when Tasha, the girl Janet once taught to read, graduated from Florida International University with a degree in education. She gave the student commencement speech, and halfway through, she paused, fighting back tears. I wouldn't be standing here if not for a woman who once sat beside me on a dusty library floor and told me I was smart when no one else did. Ms. Janet believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I carry her name with me. I always will. She now works in Liberty City, teaching second grade in the very community where Janet once volunteered. Her classroom walls are decorated with colorful posters, a quiet photo of Janet above her desk, and a wooden sign that reads, "Read, learn, shine." When I visited her classroom recently, I asked Tasha what she thought Janet would say if she could see everything now. She'd probably laugh, she said, and then she'd ask me if the kids had eaten breakfast. She cared more about that than anything. That's how Janet lives on, not in museums or statues, but in acts of ordinary kindness that ripple far beyond their origin, in the voices of children learning to read, in young women finding courage, in families finding closure without forgetting, and in those of us who still carry her story. Because even in death, some lives continue to teach. It's been 25 years since Janet Acosta left her home in Kendall, Florida, for what she thought would be an ordinary day. 25 years since she pulled into the Herald's underground parking structure, unaware that someone was waiting. Since she smiled politely, perhaps tiredly, as she made her way toward the elevator, carrying a folder full of notes on a story she never got to file. 25 years since the world around her, the newsroom, her family, the city, fractured into 1,000 irreparable pieces. And yet, somehow, in all the years since, Janet's story has endured. Not because of the crime, not even because of the trial or the execution, but because of who she was before any of that. Because Janet Acosta, by all accounts, was the kind of person we hoped to become. She was kind without expecting recognition, generous without calculation. She showed up, listened, remembered birthdays, corrected grammar with a smile, and brought Cuban pastries to morning meetings. She made people feel seen. She made them feel safe. That's what people recalled most in the interviews and conversations that filled my notebooks over the years. How she made others feel. She never made me feel small, one former intern told me. And back then, I felt small all the time. In the face of tragedy, especially violent tragedy, we tend to reach for the abstract. Statistics, systems, reforms, ideologies. Those things matter, but they can never fully speak to the human scale of loss. You can't legislate the quiet absence of someone who always knew how you took your coffee. You can't codify the way a mother's voice sounds when she says your name just right. You can't reform your way out of a broken heart. What you can do, what we must do, is remember. And not just remember the day someone died, but remember how they lived. Remember how Janet stayed late to help a colleague finish a piece. How she visited her mother every Thursday without fail. How she remembered the names of the janitorial staff. How she laughed at bad jokes. How she chose every day to be kind in a world that rarely rewards it. Those details are the real legacy, not the courtroom, not the headlines, not the execution. And in that legacy, she continues. She continues in the children who read, because she once taught them. In the young women who earn degrees in her name. In the reformed parole system that now closes the gaps that once let monsters slip through. In the son who turned pain into purpose. In the sister who turned grief into guidance. In every journalist who now checks over their shoulder when walking to their car, but who also files the story anyway, because people like Janet showed them what it means to be brave in quiet ways. People often ask me why I've stayed with this story for so long. Why I return to it every few years, writing another line, speaking another name that much of the country has long since forgotten. The truth is, I don't think I've ever left it. Because once you've been near something like this, once you've looked into the eyes of a family left hollowed out, once you've stood beside a courthouse or outside a prison and felt the silence settle over everything, you understand something essential. That justice, even when done correctly, cannot undo loss. That closure is often a myth, but that memory is an act of defiance. And to tell the story, fully, truthfully, without flinching, is a way of saying, she mattered. She still matters. In the final entry of Janet's private notebook, which Maria graciously shared with me years later, Janet had written a short quote at the top of the page in blue ink. Do not wait for greatness. Do small things well and with love. That will be your legacy. She lived that truth, and in doing so, she gave the rest of us a blueprint. Not just for surviving tragedy, but for transcending it, by showing up, by caring, by remembering, by choosing in 1,000 small ways to be good, even when the world is not. That is how stories like Janet Acosta's live on, not in the darkness that took her, but in the light she left behind. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. D Stories. These stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware, even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. If you've enjoyed tonight's tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.